Hi, everybody. Welcome to La Lista, a LatinX Writers podcast. I am your host, Ruben Mendive. Today, we have a new guest in today via Zoom because of global pandemics. So I always ask my guests to introduce themselves. So your name, how you identify, and sort of like a little bit about yourself for the people at home.
Hi, my name is River Gallo. I'm an intersex and non-binary writer, filmmaker, actor, and activist. I'm from El Salvador by way of New Jersey, and I am currently based in LA.
My follow-up question is sort of a complicated question for Latinx folk, depending on your story, but like, where are you from? Where's your family from?
Okay, so my family is from El Salvador, specifically a small village called Intipuca, which is in La Union, which is a coastal beach town in El Salvador. They came to America in 1981 because of the Salvadorian Civil War, and they lived in New York City for a while until they crossed over the bridge to the beautiful suburbs of New Jersey, where I was born. Yeah, so my whole life I grew up in a mostly Italian, Irish suburb in New Jersey that as I got older became more increasingly Latinx. But, you know, as many people who live in small towns know and who live in white suburban small towns, it's hard to not escape those, feelings of assimilation, of, kind of hiding your identity a little bit, which I think for a lot of my life was that, like, it was like, a pride. My Latinx identity was something that was for my house. And then at home, it was even, in the world, I felt like it was almost encouraged from my parents to, to be like everybody else. So I would say it wasn't until fairly recently in my life where I really started to reclaim my identity and identified those just patterns of self-oppression. Short way of saying that's where I'm from.
Yeah. No, I think, me and my family were immigrants from Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's definitely like a thing that I'm familiar with, like immigrants from the 80s and 90s, how like assimilation was so much the goal when we come here.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that assimilation, that Americanization is so based in whiteness.
Right.
And like that does so much like damage to like our own, how we view our identity, that like I think we're just now starting, as the children of those immigrants, starting to like undo it. So I'm interested in like, are there a lot of like Salvadorians in New Jersey?
No, actually, there are some, a little bit more in New York. We had some family in New York, but no, it was mostly Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, so like a lot of like Caribbean, Latinx people. So in a way, I also kind of, Caribbean Latinx people kind of also feel like home to me, just because those are a lot of my like friends and stuff that I grew up with. But yeah, we had cousins in Virginia, and in Virginia, Maryland, DC area, there were a lot of Salvadorians. Mm. So I had that kind of connection of just like kind of identifying a little bit more with like, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans growing up, and then feeling kind of recently more at home, and especially in Los Angeles, there's a huge Salvadorian population, and connecting with other Salvadorian queer people in LA has been a new relationship with that part of myself.
And so, growing up in Jersey, like, I'm curious of what your hometown was like, what your household was like growing up.
My hometown, like I mentioned, was very, Italian. The opening of Sopranos actually has a lot of, it was essentially where I grew up. Like, it has a lot of, like, the Bada Bing Club. Like, I drove past that to get to the mall. Like, it was, like, pretty much what you think of New Jersey is kind of what it is like. and I lost my virginity in the Jersey Shore. Like it was like I identify as a Jersey girl, but it was small-minded in a sense, but also had pockets of people who were liberal and stuff. And I think a lot of where I found myself actually was in the theater community in New Jersey. I started doing musicals when I was in high school, and then started doing regional like community theater, like with other people from all parts of the county. And that's probably where I first like started making friends who were like gay or queer, and yeah, that was a big outlet for me, growing up, being immersed in the theater community. So my household was, my dad was and is still an electrician in New York, and would work on big building project works. And then my parents also owned a Salvadorian restaurant in a neighboring town in New Jersey. So my home was a lot when I was younger. My parents, oh my God, I was just talking to my therapist about this. My parents were, often not around because they were working so much, or I grew up in the restaurant a lot, like either out in the restaurant, like amongst the customers and stuff, or we had like a TV room kind of in the basement. So I kind of my childhood was kind of interestingly broken up between like being at home with like a babysitter or just my sister, or being with my parents in a restaurant amongst regulars, and or like kind of submerged in this like basement world. So I think a lot of my childhood was escaped into my imagination, and into play, because of this I guess need to kind of make sense of a feeling of being a little displaced, which yeah, I guess now has its pluses because of how it's affected my writing and sensibility, and themes that I like to explore in my art, but also has a lot of maybe children of immigrants maybe have come to understand how perhaps your parents worked to meet your primal needs of safety, of food, of shelter, but how a lot of psychological and emotional needs probably weren't met as well, because of that attitude perhaps that my parents had of wanting to provide the best for us, and the best meaning basic needs and education, and beyond that mental health was a few decades away before it was actually part of the conversation, of something that was also needed as well.
I'm always curious about who people were in high school. So the prompt I always say is, who were you? Who were you pretending to be? And how did other people see you?
Who wasn't I in high school? It shifted a lot in high school. So wait, who was I? I think I was an artist who still was too afraid to claim that word. I remember just recently, actually, I found during quarantine, I went back home to Jersey, and I found my book of poetry from when I was 16 and 15. And it was, I mean, angsty is probably an understatement, but it was, at the core of it really felt like the voice of someone who was really trying to find themselves, and really felt very incredibly lonely with my queerness, with being intersex, which I didn't know the word for at the time, with just kind of feeling like kind of lost a little bit, but also someone who had really big dreams and aspirations of wanting to get out of New Jersey, and having this kind of blind hope that eventually that was what I was going to do, because I had no other option. Otherwise I would just suffer and die in a suburban hell. So that's who I was. Who was I pretending to be? Straight. Probably that was the biggest one. I think the beginning of high school, like, I tried to, I've always had a great fashion sense, but like, I definitely, had the phases of where I wore, like all Sean John and FUBU and, the velour suits. And then it graduated to like, all Hollister and all Abercrombie. And then, when Urban Outfitters was a thing, like slightly scene/emo. And then like by my senior year of high school, I think where I really found myself was in theater and kind of just, I think that's where I kind of became an individual and just kind of, was able to have maybe an undefinable fashion sense. And I did win Best Dressed in high school. That was my superlative. And it was almost like it was a hands down, like everyone knew that I was going to win. And I did. And, but yeah, that's who maybe I pretended to be, or my mask, I guess, in the world was through my fashion. And in a way, people respected me for that, for being an individual. I think people saw me as someone who probably was gay, but didn't know that yet or was in denial. I think people saw me, as someone with a unique perspective and someone. I think people generally thought that I was going to make it somehow, and that I would really. My senior year, I applied early decision to NYU, and it was like, I mean, my school wasn't, it was a public school. It wasn't one of the better schools in the county. There were a lot of like just fucking idiots in my school. Not like actually stupid, which I'm sure there were too, but there were a lot of like people that were like, this mentality of that, like you would go to school and maybe work in that town and forever be there, like these like townies. But my senior year, I applied early decision to NYU because I knew that I wanted to live in New York and be in New York. And I got in early decision, and I think that's probably people really saw me as someone who had a shot of getting out there through my acting, that they saw me in plays, or through my just general, like people knew I was different in a good way. And sometimes I was made fun of, but I think people always had the general, like maybe consciously or unconsciously, like they knew that I was gonna get the fuck out by some will or some way.
And so did you end up going to NYU?
I did. I ended up going to NYU to study drama, specifically to study experimental theater. And that program was probably the most formative 4 years of my life. I went from, that kind of environment in New Jersey to like in the middle of Greenwich Village in New York. And, I was exposed to different people from around the country, and, being in the middle of the city and access to drugs, which, definitely played a factor in how I learned to perceive myself differently, and at times, interfered with the way I saw myself in life. But the program itself, the experimental theater program, was, I mean, even to this day, the way I think about it is just kind of like, it was I was being taught like movement and choreography and voice work by like, hippies that were around in like the 60s and just did a lot of acid. And like, so they were just like, I mean, that wasn't their defining what made them, but it was a real radically different way of perceiving acting and performance, in that they helped cultivate individual voices and individual sensibilities to telling stories, which at the time I was then, working on making performance art pieces or small plays and small movement pieces. But then that groundwork of, telling stories in real time to real audiences and to my peers, to my teachers, it was really the foundation of how my then screenwriting and then my filmmaking got to be, because it was, in theater, you can't hide behind cuts or edits or, really the texture and the tone and the atmosphere that you're creating happens within one step and one breath on stage. So it was really there that I learned what kind of stories I want to share and how best I tell them based on my own experience and personality.
Yeah, and I'm always curious about like where the writing came in for you, because you mentioned you had like poetry in high school. So like, what was like the through line of like, was it something that you like, that you knew you were attracted to, that you knew you were good at? Just, can you like talk us through that?
I think I was always writing either some kind of poetry or journaling since very younger, like very little. I don't know, maybe as far back as like the fourth grade or something. In high school, poetry definitely became more of a release for me to reckon with and grapple with my queerness in a way that I didn't know how to, because I, was partially in the closet, in denial, and didn't have the language available or the resources or community available to, really come to terms with it. But I always loved writing an essay. I don't know why. In high school, there was something, and I also did debate as well. And I think the two are essay writing and debating are very closely intertwined, because it all has to do with, a thesis that you start off with, and then defending your thesis, and then being questioned and cross-examined, and then forming some kind of resolution and a solution to that. And I think it's a very like ancient Greek form of discussing one issue or one topic. And I guess that that always kind of exhilarated me a little bit, to be able to, within your own words and within your own writing, to present something as truth, and also to defend that truth, and to provide some kind of hope or solution that of how that truth could then affect other people. That's funny. I never even really thought about debate and how that affected my writing. But I think when I started writing plays and stuff, which then turned into screenplays my last year of undergrad, and then going into grad school for screenwriting and directing, I think I've always been, really drawn to the hero's journey. And, I think at first going to school for experimental theater, I thought structure was bullshit, and everything should be radical and weird and different. And I hate, I don't want anything to be like something that it was before. But I think what I've learned about my writing, in terms of that kind of groundwork in debate and in, essays and in poetry, was that it's less about, structure is really important, as, all screenwriters, know having some kind of structure, but that it comes from a strong personal perspective, and wanting to make that strong personal perspective clear to other people, and not only just exerting oh, this is what I think, but this is what I think, and why I think you should know about what I think, because it could, it can inspire you to think differently, or it could provide some kind of healing or some kind of transcendence of old ideas into something new. And I guess that's maybe what always really inspired me about writing, was the kind of the alchemy component to it, that you can just start off in A, and through some kind of process, then come out with this different result that then you as the writer are thereby changed by it. And through that change, the audience who hears it is also, or feels that story, is also changed by the writing.
You mentioned that you went to grad school. So did you go to grad school right after undergrad?
I went to grad school 2 years after undergrad.
Okay.
When I left undergrad, I was trying to be an actor, and working and living at home in Jersey, and it wasn't really that successful because I think at the time people still were just starting to identify as queer. So for a while I was just saying that I was gay, and non-binary and stuff. That was like, woof, that was light years away. I mean, this was like 2013, 14. This was like pre even like Laverne Cox. Like even transness was still something that like in pop culture wasn't as explored as it is now. So essentially, agents and managers that I was meeting were like, "Yeah, you're great, but like we have no idea what you could play."
Yeah.
And I guess they sensed some inauthenticity of me trying to be these like straight cis characters, and they like could sense that, and they're like, "No, you can't." And I'm like, oh, "Okay, fine, fuck you." So yeah, I tried to do that for a while, and then by some blessing and also bad luck, I ended up getting going through this insane medical crisis where I was essentially bedridden for I had a really bad like skin, like eczema, like skin condition. I was essentially handicapped for a year. Like I couldn't work, I couldn't do anything. During that time, I thought like, as an actor, for your skin to get bad, it was like you're done. Like what can you do if you can't be on screen anymore? And even if it didn't look that bad, I felt awful, and I felt so self-conscious and like, uh, ugly. And so I had, it was a pretty dark year and a half of just not knowing, trying to repivot like what I really wanted to do in life. And I knew I had a sense of like, even if I didn't feel comfortable in front of the camera, that I needed to still keep telling stories and still, pursue that. So I continued screenwriting, and then I was just like, I guess I should have just applied to filmmaking for grad school to, be a director and be behind the camera. And I just kind of Googled the best film school in the country. And then it was like USC. I was like, oh, I've never heard of that before. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'll apply there. And then I ended up getting in. And then I was still going through like, my medical situation. But I just had this driving force in me just telling me that like that things would get better if I had some kind of will to live. And I guess going to school and going and moving across the country to LA, even though on the outside it was just like, well, how are you even going to be able to survive, to go to school, to physically be capable of not being cared for by my mom, who was caring for me while I was really sick. Despite all those real doubts and concerns, something in me just knew that I had to go to LA. And so I did in 2015. And then yeah, it's probably been the best decision that I made in my life.
Yeah, and I'm always curious when people move to LA. Like someone told me this, and I just always repeat it. It's like the first 2, 3 years are like the hardest, but like if you can sort of survive those 2 years, then you're sort of like, you've sort of like walked through the fire, and you're gonna be here.
Yeah.
So can you just describe? I would like to just get a sense for like people who just moved here or planning to move here. What were those first 2 years like for you? Also just like the difference between like New York and Jersey and LA.
Well, I think I had a unique experience coming to LA because I came for grad school. So I was already kind of immersed in a community. And there were also a lot of people from NYU, actors that I went to school with, who were also already here. So I already had a bit of a personal like connections and cushion. I would imagine if I didn't have any of that and I just moved to LA, it probably would have been a lot harder for me. But the first 2 years or 3 years of LA, I mean, they were kind of nice. I mean, I had student loan money. I was, it wasn't completely terrible. I mean, USC itself, the program was really hard. I learned so much going there, and became connected with, some of my collaborators I'm going to work with for the rest of my life there, and the teachers there. Some really were so inspirational to be around, and to be taught from. But it was also difficult in the sense of like coming from a school, my acting school, that was so interested in your own unique vision and unique voice, and then going to a school like USC that was more traditional in the sense of like, we learned how to filmmaking through Hollywood standards, and USC, the film school, was almost like the Hollywood studio in a sense, and everything had to get approved and everything was kind of questioned. You were always kind of, it was kind of like making movies in kind of like a negative space, in the sense of like you were always being a little bit critiqued by what you were doing, as opposed to kind of like, encouraged to explore your individuality. It was just like, I think a lot of my time in the beginning of USC was spent, not making queer stories, because I was like, oh, I want to expand myself, and I don't want everyone to think that that's all that I do. But my work suffered because I don't fucking give a shit about anything else. So it wasn't until like my third year where I made my thesis, where I was just like, okay, I'm gonna write this story that's Ponyboi, that's very personal. It's about a queer intersex person in New Jersey who's a sex worker, and I'm gonna act in it, and I'm gonna do all those things, and it was through that I actually really found myself. So it actually, strangely, the third year of being in LA felt actually when I really actually like dug into who I am.
And can you just like describe the process of like making Ponyboi, and sort of like your own process to be like, it's a big thing to like tell a personal story, like act in it. Like it seems like this whole film was so much like you mentioned, like a part of like your authentic storytelling and who you were and the stories you wanted to tell.
Yeah.
So like, can you sort of talk about that process?
Ponyboi, the process of it actually really started in 2012 and 2013, when I was making a theater piece as my thesis for grad school, or for undergrad at NYU, that was about a queer runaway sex worker, who kind of like was a drifter on the highways of in New Jersey. And it was a lot kind of darker, and kind of had this like Rocky Horror kind of element, but like definitely more like camp, and more like it was theater. But yeah, that piece really then kind of, I guess, always stayed in my mind, and it turned into a film that I did shortly after graduating undergrad. Oh yeah, in those 2 years I made a short film between undergrad and grad school, and that became like the first like piece of film that I did, and that I was acting in, and I directed and I wrote. I guess I couldn't really shake that story off a little bit, and when it came time to do my thesis for grad school, I realized how much of that just still wasn't told completely, and just how much of that was also just awesome, that I was just like, I should just, keep revisiting, that kind of world. And so I started developing, the story for Ponyboi, which was about a sex worker who works out of a laundromat in New Jersey. And through this like mysterious and magical encounter with this cowboy character, is able to heal some of his trauma from growing up intersex. And I guess the intersex component was the big part that still didn't click. Or I guess it took the time for me to make my thesis, for me to finally synthesize that part of my identity. Because I actually didn't know that the word intersex existed until I was writing the film. So essentially I grew up, when I was 12, I found out that my parents told me, and my doctors told me, they all sat me down one day and said that I was born without testicles, and that I would need to start taking testosterone therapy in order to induce my puberty. And then at 16, I had which I now believe and firmly believe was an unconsensual plastic surgery in which prosthetic testicles were implanted in my scrotum. I say it's unconsensual now because after identifying as non-binary, which happened 2 or 3 years ago, I realized that it wasn't necessary for me to have prosthetic testicles to look like a cisgendered male body. And that was really a decision that my doctor and my parents made for me, and that I really didn't have a question about. It was just kind of presented to me as like, this was just kind of like what I needed to do in order to be a man. So yeah, when I was writing Ponyboi, I wanted to put more of that personal narrative into the film. And so I just kind of Googled the condition that I was born with, which is called anorexia. And so I just was curious as to if there was any new literature about the condition. And then I stumbled upon articles about being intersex. And I was like, wait, what? And then it turned out that my condition was a part of around 40 different variations and conditions under the intersex umbrella. So intersex, the definition is an umbrella term for people born with bodies that don't fit the typical definitions of male or female. So it could be, in your chromosomes, hormonally, or in your physical actual genitals. So there's a wide range of how people can be intersex. And it occurs in about 1.7% of the population, which is about as many people as there are with red hair. So it's like interesting in that, like, it's definitely, less people are intersex than not intersex, but it's not entirely uncommon. But there's so much stigma and so much personal shame, perpetuated by the medical industry, and by the lack of resources to intersex kids and children, denying them of community, and denying parents of knowledge of the options and choices that they really have. That intersex people and intersex narratives and intersex identities in the media have been silenced forever. It's not really an exaggeration. It's actually that there are zero intersex stories in television and movies. And there's Middlesex by Jeffrey Euripides, something like that. It was on like Oprah's book club. And that's most people's entry point towards intersex is that novel. To the intersex community, sidebar. So the intersex community is riddled with a lot of problems and he historically didn't want any consultation from the intersex community, and he was a cis white man. So yeah, there's just been a long general history of erasing intersex people medically and erasing their voices on a political level, on a media level. So when I was making Ponyboi, I realized that that there was a community, B, that there's a human rights component to it, in the sense that these intersex people and children are being operated on without their consent, and being denied body autonomy. And so I realized that it was necessary for me to then come out as intersex, to put that in the film, and to become an activist. And so yeah, that's kind of what led me to Ponyboi and the form it took on.
I have heard the term intersex before. I think I was first introduced to it when it was sort of like one of the letters and like
Right.
LGBTQIA. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple. I'm an old millennial, so sorry.
That's got it. LGBTQIA plus.
And then just a more like umbrella term of queerness.
Right.
But I think that's when I was first introduced to it. And I'm just curious of like your sense of like, because I know even like the trans community doesn't feel like they're like fully embraced in that alphabet. So I'm just curious of like what your sense is of like intersex and queerness and like Pride Month and the whole like thing of it. Does it feel representational? Does it feel like, because I know some people might have issue like, oh, we feel like we're something different. Like, so
Right.
like, what's your sense of that?
I think there's a few things. One, I think there's an inherent queerness in being intersex. I think inherently the way you're born, you're born to an experience that's so different to a degree that even if you identify as cisgender, because you could have an intersex variation and also identify as cis, and have many friends that are intersex and do identify as cis. Your experience is so radically different, and your rights are oppressed. That there is an inherent queerness in that. Not to say that queerness is defined by oppression, but I think all people who have identities that are different from cis whiteness are oppressed. So to me, there are some intersex people who don't who wish to not be included in the alphabet. I would say the vast majority of intersex people do. It is complicated because even within the queer community, there's a lot of people that don't know what intersex is. To me, it's difficult because we need the queer community to be our allies if cis people are going to give a shit about us. I've done my best since coming out as intersex to be as a compassionate and caring educator to queer people who don't know what intersex is. I mean, it even starts with like, I'll enter a room and I'll say that I'm intersex, and then like I know in my mind people will be nodding and say, yeah, I know what that is. But in their mind, if you ask them, they'd be like, they couldn't tell you. Because people, especially in the queer community, don't want to, be offensive to other queer people. But I think there's no shame in not knowing and being, having the humility to be like, please educate me. So even though that sometimes is difficult, so I've taken upon myself to be that person to try my best to educate the queer community, because yeah, you'd be surprised. I was actually one time talking with one of my intersex friends about this. Like, we were guessing, like, if we went to, just some random city somewhere, or even a major city in the United States, and we like just asked people on the street, like, what percentage of people would actually know what intersex is? And then we were like, well, what if we, asked, like, went into a queer community, asked how many percentage of the people would be able to say a clear definition of what it is. And the reality is both in both instances, they would probably be shockingly more low than you would imagine. And it's just weird because it's like, we are here and we've never not existed. But I think, it's taking people a while to feel comfortable talking about their experience if you're intersex people, because when you talk about being intersex, you're immediately speaking about the most intimate parts of your body. Like, and to your discretion, you could not disclose it, or you cannot, like, I could have not told you now, but often I feel by sharing my story, you get a tangible perspective of what it means to be intersex, and in that way, you're able to understand it more. So even if I am not comfortable sometimes sharing it, I always find the activist in me needs to share it in order for people to really grasp the concept. But to me, I honestly feel that there's some unconscious resistance to the concept of being intersex, because it's by queer people and by cis people, because it's this idea of like, that you could be born in a body that's not really one or the other. And we're so conditioned and have been socially programmed to understand things as a binary. Even though that is changing now, I still think that that's the culprit for the reason why intersex people up until now haven't really had the platforms or the stories being told. And if there are stories being told, they're fetishized or sensationalized or didn't have the input of the intersex community in it. So there's like a lot of deep layers that it goes into that really need to be rattled up and shaken. And that's part of the reason why I really have been trying to put them into my stories.
It's like, because, when I first learned of it, I was like, it's part of the alphabet. But I was also like those letters together have always just meant to me more than anything like solidarity.
Right.
I think that's the thing we should all have in common above all else. It's like
Right.
solidarity. Because you're right. It's like not white cisness, it's something else. And again, if you're not that, then it's very oppressive. So I think solidarity works well, only to our advantage, of course.
Yeah.
So I'm curious of like what you did after Ponyboi, after grad school. Like, what have you been up to in LA?
After Ponyboi, we did our like festival run, and I was traveling a bunch to the different festivals, while at the same time starting to write the feature of Ponyboi, which I thought could happen much faster than I anticipated. But it took, all things considered, so I finished it last month, and it's now being packaged and sent, and it's now being seen and read, and people love it, and which I'm really happy about. But it took a year and a half, year and 8 months. And I heard of people working on features for like years. So I guess it's not incredibly slow. I'm incredibly that bad for a first time feature. But a lot of my year was focused on getting the scripts into a place where, well, first getting an outline. I think that was my mistake, was I thought that because I did all this groundwork on the short, that suddenly this feature was just going to come to me. And I, it's like, oh, I did it already, so it's just going to be longer. But what really struck me in the process was figuring out why the hell was I making this, other than, there was the career element of like, people love the short. So it's just like, okay, I have this fertile ground of like, I have people's attention right now. I want to launch my career in Hollywood as an actor, as a writer, as a filmmaker. I have to deliver something. But then there was also just this like unconscious resistance of like, do I deserve this? Are my parents really happy that I'm a filmmaker? Like, maybe I should just, go back to school and, have a stable job, or like, all the fears. And in addition to that, in the short, there was a very abridged version, or abridged exploration of the intersex narrative within the short. And I knew that in the feature, it was going to be a very deep dive and a very driving force in the character's narrative, in Ponyboy's narrative, for why, everything's in his life is happening, and that how that would all have to be explained. And so for me, I knew that would mean that I would have to go into my own, trauma and my own, history and memory of growing up intersex, which a lot of it had to do with, or a lot of the pain that I went through was related to, being a child of, Salvadorian immigrants who came, and, there's that machismo culture in El Salvador and much of Latin America, that, my parents really wanted me to be a normal boy and really wanted me to be masculine. And that wasn't the case, both because of who I am, but also literally how I was born. I was missing a missing piece that made me, a man. And I think that haunted them throughout my childhood, because they knew that whatever was going to happen with me, it was going to be different than what they had ever planned or imagined. And so I think, call it that I'm intuitive or maybe a little psychic, but I think I always sense that tension with my parents, now reflecting on it, that I was never going to live up to the expectations that they had of me because of the way my body was born. And the way I think I internalized that was that you guys made me this way because I was born of you. So it was like this tension of like rebelling against, I was a product of you, but you are rejecting who I am, but also, fuck you guys because I am you. So in so many words, that was a big, big tension that I realized had to be integrated and woven into the Ponyboi narrative. And, that was very deeply personal and, hard to write about, because at the end of the day, really, I realized that despite all of that, I had to come to a place to understand that my parents did the best that they could, that they were, they didn't go to college, they grew up on dirt floors. They really worked their way to the top to be here. They swam over the Rio Grande, they fucking hustled to get here. And for them to know that, then discover that I was intersex when I was young, they honestly did whatever the doctors told them to do because, we believe the things that doctors tell us. And so there was a real moment of my own journey to personally forgive my parents for whatever attention I felt towards them about how they handled me being intersex. That then, also became really the core of the story as well, was Ponyboi finding forgiveness for his family and the way they treated him.
I am always curious with writers. It's like, in your writing, do you feel like there's a through line to like everything you've written, the themes that you're attracted to, the stuff that always calls you? Do you feel like there's a through line through it?
I'm definitely really interested in personal empowerment. I'm definitely really interested in finding salvation in yourself, which has like a bit of a both Catholic and anti-Catholic undertones, which is also a theme. Yeah, spirituality is definitely something that that is really of interest to me, and but spirituality in a sense of radical, like in like a radical examination of or reckoning of yourself as inherently whole and good and perfect. And I think I'm really drawn to characters and really low stakes and really flawed people who then through the journey of a lifetime, who are able to really come to terms with their part in their choices and their part in being able to free themselves. Yeah, I'd say a general through line in the stories that I like, that I write about, is about self-actualization. I love self-help books. That is like my number one read books that I read. So there's like tones of that in it, but I like to do it with like a Trojan horse kind of way of like, you don't even know that that's happening. And then by the end, you're like, oh my God, I am beautiful and powerful and I can do it all. And the patriarchy sucks. So yeah, that's kind of like how I come at my writing mostly, because the way I see it is, things, as we could all attest, are really on the surface level and on very deep structural levels are really fucked right now. In terms of race and gender and in politics and you name it, it's really fucked up right now. But I think as artists, or for me personally, I have to not only point out how the bad in people, or the bad in a character, and the bad of certain, like a world of people in my stories. But for me, I think I have a responsibility to provide some kind of hope and provide some kind of solution, provide something that will pull us out of where we're from, otherwise, what's the point? Otherwise, you're just pointing at something, but you're not actually doing anything that can incite any kind of change. And for me, at my deepest core, that's really what I want to do with my work. I want it to live on, not just in the sense of that it can be viewed or read for years to come, and even after I die. But like, I want, lasting, people to change their minds about things, about gender, about being intersex, and then for policies then and legislation to be changed.
I'm curious about what it was, because it's like you mentioned you didn't really even have the word intersex, so you started in grad school. So I'm just curious what what it's like to be like an out intersex person. Like, I'm familiar. I'm like, I've seen, the photo shoots, all the glamour of it. So, but again, it's like
that part I forgot to talk about what happened then after I graduated grad school. But no, yes, what was it like to be out in intersex? Well, yes, as I said, there was a bit of suddenly I was taking a lot more pictures, and suddenly was modeling for things, and had all this attention and stuff, and that's still also happening. It was weird because it was like, I like my looks and stuff, and I also think like everyone, I'm self-conscious about certain things as well. But it was weird, boggled the shit out of me how all these people wanting to take my pictures and put me on the magazine cover because I was intersex, and that was the real. I mean, also because of how I look, but that was like what suddenly everybody was interested in, and it was crazy to me how because I decided to be authentic to myself and to my experience, about something that I thought that I was going to keep a secret my whole life, how suddenly that very thing that I thought was going to keep hidden turned out to be this actual gift and superpower and blessing that I just never imagined that would even be possible. So being out this past, I think it's been 2 years, 2.5 years, has been just like a roller coaster. I mean, I spent most of my life not knowing that I would ever tell anybody about this. And then suddenly everybody wants to know about it. And also on some days more than others, I want to tell everybody about it. So it's been deeply humbling. I didn't know that I would ever be the first intersex person to write and direct and star in an intersex role in cinema history. Like I didn't think that would even be possible, that would never have been done before, and that would have been done by me. So sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap my mind about how everything's kind of played out the past 2 years, but I'm also kind of really looking through my crystal ball of like, well, if this has happened, I'm like doing the math. I'm like, well, if this happened these 2 years, well, what's going to happen in 2 more years?
Yeah.
Because to me, I really have the feeling and sense that really the sky's the limit. And as long as I keep putting out good shit, which I think my shit's pretty good, like, I mean, yeah, I'm really looking forward to what's going to happen next.
I mean, there's a lesson for that for everyone. It's not just like for intersex people. It's like for everybody. Like we're all like, not to sound like all like hokey or whatever, but like we're all special. We're all unique. Like there is that within all of us to like. Yeah. And again, it's like releasing the shame of something that's like holding you back, and it's like being your authentic self. To like, there's so much power in that.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something that everybody is running away from, and that's the very thing that you need to run towards. And maybe as writers, that is probably one of the hardest things to do, because we work in these isolated environments, and we talk to people about our ideas, or we have help or sometimes writing partners, but the act of writing is really a solitary embodied act that is really just your mind, your memories, your hands, the computer. Like it's this very like psychologically taxing task that we do, and we have to do it for hours. Not to say all writing needs to be like, you know, your personal like trauma spelled out in 3 acts, but I'm of the belief that like you have to write the things that you care most about, that you give a shit about. Otherwise, no one's going to give a shit about it. Like if there isn't the kernel of like, you know, what you really care about in your writing, it's going to show immediately. And that's not to say that, you know, if you're writing a rom-com, you have to talk about your daddy issues in it. But like, you know, you have to, some part of yourself has to be in your writing. Otherwise, people can smell that it's not going to be good. Or it could be, you know, you could sell it, but, you know, it won't, on screen it won't be good. Or I don't know. I don't want to speculate on, you know, people's writing careers, but I just think that, using your personal experience in some, or at least I like to say sometimes that, you know, my work isn't, you know, if it's not autobiographical, at least it's like emotionally autobiographical to a certain extent.
Yeah, and even if it's like, even just do it for yourself, you know, like there's so much power in like putting something that's so personal within you, and then the process that is healing, somebody seeing it and being like, that's my story too.
Yeah.
It's like this thing that you felt so alone about and didn't think anybody in the world, everyone's like, it's like, there's nothing better than that, you know?
Yeah, no, totally. That probably was, that is what makes it worth it, because you think you're doing this thing for yourself or for your career or, you know, for other people's expectations, but then, you know, you realize that it's actually the people who read it can be changed by it, or the people who see the film, you know, on screen, or then like, you know, having a full emotional experience. I had one of my friends came to see Ponyboi at one of our screenings, and she has an autistic daughter, and her husband and her came, and you know, they were talking to me after the film, and they, you know, just in tears, like bawling, and they were just like, you know, we related to the film because we thought about our daughter, and how like when they told us she was autistic, we didn't know what to do, and we were so confused, just like, you know, how Ponyboy's parents like kind of, you know, did the best they could, and they, you know, they didn't know what to do. And so it blew my mind. I was like, whoa, like how one story, you know, you bring all of yourself to your story. If it's good, you bring all yourself to the story, and then when you match yourself at that energy, people will come to it with whatever their story is, and they'll make the dots and connect the dots. And then that's where like real healing happens. It's like, you know, when you fully are there for your art, people will fully be there for it too.
You know, just to start wrapping up, I'm always curious about who my guests are fans of. So this could be heroes of yours, peers. I always call it like whoever you stalk on Instagram.
Oh,
Who you like don't even really know, but you just love watching their work from afar. So who are some of those people for you?
oh my God, this is scary. Okay. Some of the people for me. I love Tanya Sriracha. I think she's amazing. And I think what she does for the community is just amazing. Heroes of mine that I don't stalk on Instagram, David Lynch. I'm such a freak for Lynch. You know, even though he's a cis white man, there are some good ones left. I mean, Stephen Canals from Pose. I mean, Pose, especially season 1, fundamentally shifted my consciousness. And, you know, I think it's one of the most important shows that has been around in television to depict transness and to depict just, you know, characters really struggling through AIDS and through all. It made me realize how much in some ways we have it really easy now, but this is pre-corona that I probably would have said that. Now I'm like, I don't know. It's pretty weird right now. But I guess it just, and I've seen things that depicted AIDS before, but never, I don't know, something clicked about that show with me that really made me feel like, wow, like the weight that had on our community was unfathomable.
So we sort of got connected through like the Disruptor Fellowship. I just wanted to know, like, what, I know it's still early in the process, but like, what has been your experience of it? And like, what attracted you to this fellowship as, like, what do you think you're getting out of this one that you felt like maybe wasn't really like available in a lot of them?
Well, this is my first fellowship, actually. Well, not true. I had a residency last year on a farm, but it was like a week long, and I was like pretty much farming and just chilling and working on my script by writing really sad poetry. So which is necessary. Sometimes, I mean, writing, there's this whole, capitalistic like feeling sometimes when we're writing where we think we have to be productive and the only way to write is to be with your fingers on the keys in final draft, like making it happen. But the truth is, like, you really need to write some sad poetry sometimes. You really need to go watch a movie or have dinner or like go talk to your friends, maybe smoke some weed. Like you need to live like as a human in order for your art to then, be any interesting. But long way to way of saying, the Disruptors Fellowship, it has been so amazing so far. We're all doing it through Zoom, which has been, I mean, at first I think we're all a little bummed just because, like, we want to, there's something about being together, but it really does feel like we're together and we're, making something happen despite, against all odds and stuff. With the whole COVID situation. But what I really have appreciated about the first few weeks that we've been in it is the groundwork in cultural empowerment that we've been focusing on, and the artists as the disruptor, the activists, the people who change the way people think, the people who then lead the government to change policies because people have changed the way they thought. And so for me, I always, because of that immigrant mentality of like, I'm not doing anything because I'm just like writing stories and stuff. It was really important for me to get grounded in the fact that this is serious work. I mean, it's fun sometimes, but also it's labor, and also it's a duty that needs to be, that culture needs. I mean, right now everyone's at home watching TV all the time and like what's and reading books, and like it was writers who wrote that, who are able to transcend their own lives and experiences to take other people on journeys that will hopefully do the same for them. So to me, kind of doing that foundational work of realizing that my work as an artist has a gravity, that it's not just fun or fluff, or that it's to save people's lives, really. That has been really, I've never needed to know those things more. And now we're kind of getting into like the like what we want to write and the goals of our program. And so I'm really excited about what I end up writing, what pilot I end up writing. It's all cooking right now.
Yeah, no, and I say that sort of all the time. It's like, that's why I started this podcast, was because I was seeing so little Latinx representation, so little Latinx writers. The representation we had, Latinx writers weren't even writing those stories.
Right.
And I think the media does such a good job about telling us who we are and telling other people who we are. So if we're not part of that conversation, we're not part of that process, someone else is dictating that. And you're right, people are sitting right now watching COVID, they're watching hours of television, and it's like, what is the content of Latinx, queer people, POC, Black folks that are like they learn so much about the world through that.
Right.
And it's important that we should like have ownership over that.
Yeah, totally. And I would even say, like, for me, I think I was running the other day and I had this, like, I don't know, some idea kind of came to me about like something about my pilot and stuff. And I don't know, I just thought of like some kind of like, and the guy's closeted and then he has this secret affair with the farmer. And like, and I'm like, wait, River, we have to stop this right now. We as queer people, as Latinx people, as, we have to recognize the narratives that have already been put out about us, and how do we subvert those? How do we, modify them, or how do we completely tell stories that aren't those anymore? Because like the coming out stuff, the the struggling, all that, it has its place, but we're coming at a point, I feel like, in culture where we need to literally break out of these well-worn grooves and patterns that, have been mostly made by cis white people in the way that they see us and we're portrayed in media. So yeah, it's time now more than ever to reclaim that space for ourselves. That's always existed, but I guess it's taken up until now to for things to really break through.
Yeah. So now that brings me to my last question.
Yes.
I asked my guest to title the podcast episode. So the prompt is a blank Latinx writer. And you can fill in that blank with whatever is true to you, your writing, this conversation. It's also used as a recruitment tool. So when people see the title, they can find community, solace, that someone else, there's a writer just like them out there.
A non-binary, intersex, empowered writer.
Perfect. Love that. So, and where can people find you? So what's the social media, all that?
People can find me at River Gallo. So that's RiverGallo. My website's rivergallo.com. I'm going to be on my first episode of television for Love, Victor, which is this
Oh, wow.
It premieres on Hulu. I'm on a cute little episode. It comes out June 19th, I think. So yeah, if you see that show, watch out for my face. And then screenshot it, take a pic, tag me. I'm there. This is my first thing. And I might have only a few lines, but you know what? I'm there.
Groundbreaking,
Yeah, exactly. Groundbreaking intersex people on television. The story